Welcome to the conversation on the Young Turks. We got a great guest for you guys right now. Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat from NYU. She's an authoritarianism expert, an expert on fascism as well. She wrote the book, Italian Fascism's Empire Cinema. Ruth, welcome to the Young Turks. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I can't wait to ask you about the comparison of Mussolini to Trump. Let's keep it real. That's going to happen. But before we get there, you wrote an interesting piece about some of the characteristics of authoritarianism. And one is to strike back against your enemies once you get to lawlessness. And post-impeachment, we appear to be at lawlessness. And certainly Trump is striking back against his enemies. Can you just tell us a little bit about how he's doing that and why you think that is an authoritarian trait?
Well, impeachment is a huge blow to any leader, and Trump, like all authoritarians, is most dangerous when he feels threatened. His entire rationale is to stay in office as long as possible so he can keep, enriching himself, and everything he does is to the end of consolidating his power. So right now, with coronavirus and also starting from when he was impeached, he's been purging, he's gotten more paranoid, and all authoritarians rule by, it's called divide and rule. They like to pit everybody against each other so they can be supreme. And they ritually humiliate their cabinet. It's like a revolving door. They hire and fire. They insult people. So you see a lot more of these behaviors, and he's now on to a series of firings of inspectors general, because anybody with that title, inspector general, is not going to be someone Trump likes, because authoritarians, the point of it is to not be accountable.
Yeah. So he's fired a number of inspectors general, including people who investigated him. But the one that stood out to me most was when he got rid of the guy who would check to see if they were misspending the new bailout money. Because if you're going to rob a bank, you'd fire the cop in front of the bank first. So,
yeah. Authoritarians, it's all about capturing. There's a phrase called authoritarian capture, and that can refer to domesticating the judiciary and the press, but it's also about resources, because all of these guys are very corrupt. And their purpose in being, they're not there to govern, they're there to enrich themselves and their cronies. So you take someone who has years of doing this in business, like Trump, and he becomes president. So this windfall, this huge, resource of money that's been allocated for the coronavirus, it's clear he's not going to keep his hands off it. And he's going to have someone there who he knows is a loyalist. So this was the reason for the latest shuffling.
Yeah. So you wrote a book about Mussolini, and as I was reading what you wrote about Mussolini, I thought it's almost a word-for-word description of what I was saying about Trump, even in the 2016 election. So it must have been fascinating seeing Trump unfold, not only just because authoritarian leaders in general, but like the similarities to Mussolini seem striking. So, for example, when you talk about his hunger for approval and how the personas are created by this symbiosis with the crowd, I remember telling the audience, he's crowd surfing. He's asking the crowd what they want to hear. He's almost A/B testing, I would say, in 2015 and 2016. And then when he hears something that they like, he gives it back to them, right? So how similar is that to what Mussolini did?
Oh, totally similar. And I have been studying fascism for a really long time, and then I had done this book on film propaganda under fascism. And basically, I started doing all the media work I do when I saw Trump speaking to the crowd. And I literally ran home to do an op-ed for CNN. And then I wrote an article in August 2016 about Trump and Mussolini, because there were so many similarities with the way that this is when he was, of course, a candidate, the way he had the loyalty oath for the crowd and kind of the messaging, the relentless propaganda to get them to think the way he does, and demonizing the press. And it was all extremely similar, as well as the personality type, because all of these authoritarian leaders have a similar personality type. The outcome is very different. Obviously, Hitler and Mussolini committed genocide. You have people today who, like Erdogan in Turkey, has mass imprisonment. So the outcomes are different, but their personalities are quite the same.
Yeah, and then another interesting tie is the constant need to market themselves. You call them mass marketers. And where did the nickname Il Duce come from for Mussolini? Did he adopt that? Was that part of his marketing?
He actually, they all are marketers, or a lot of them have been, like Mussolini was a journalist for years, and he was a really good writer, and he was good at having slogans. And he also knew how to borrow stuff that was in the air that was very compelling. So he didn't invent the Duce title, which came from ancient Rome, but he basically stole the title, the idea of the black shirt and the raised arm salute from this poet D'Annunzio, who was politically active right before he took power. So these are guys who are masters at seeing what works. Like you were saying before, Trump actually test markets stuff. And I don't know if you recall, after he got elected, he said at one point to a rally, he said, "I don't think we need to do the lock her up thing anymore." And they loved it so much, it's part of their rituals, which are really important for authoritarians, that he decided he should keep it because it was part of his shtick with them. It's how he leads them and gets their approval. So these men are superb marketers. They're superb at sensing the crowd and adapting themselves to the crowd. And that's why they are so popular.
Yeah. And I've said that, look, I think Trump's IQ is below 70. But the one thing he does do well is marketing. And it's very simple. It's not nuanced at all. It's just run towards the camera and then give the crowd what they want. That's it. And then do it over and over and over again. And that repetition is part of the propaganda. But there's also these, that's my simple way of looking at it. I think it's most of the ball game. But as I read the details of what you write, it's really interesting, the similarities. So, for example, they both are preoccupied, or a lot of authoritarians are preoccupied with luxury. Is that just because they're in charge and they have more power? So why not give themselves more stuff, which is part of the point, as you explained earlier, corruption? Or is there a second point to that?
I think they're men. The secret of their personality cults is that they have to be everyman, but they also have to be Superman above everyone else. And a lot of them are very greedy individuals. Putin is famously acquisitive. Like too much is never enough for them. It could be power, it could be luxury goods, could be women for a lot of them. And they're kind of hoarders. They're hoarders of our attention. They monopolize us 24/7, our attention, the media's attention. And an interesting thing about Trump, he may have not a good intelligence in some ways, but he's extremely visual. And the White House photographer who shot every president since Reagan said that when he shot Trump, no one had ever been that attentive to every small camera angle. And he said most presidents were in and out in like 5-10 minutes. Trump was over a half an hour because he was so meticulous about how he was being photographed. And that's something to think about.
Yeah, and that's part of his marketing. It's also being overweight, and that one I could relate to. Make sure you're shooting from above so it looks better and you don't get my double chin.
They're very vain, all of these men, and from Mussolini, who was extremely vain. And one amusing thing is that Mussolini pioneered showing off his body, his pecs, and the only ruler since then to do it so much is Putin. So Trump can't do that because he's not in shape and he's older. So he borrows other men's bodies. So he photoshopped his head onto the body of Rocky, of Sylvester Stallone, and then he tweeted it from his personal account. So they're very vain. They're very into being macho, whether they have to borrow other men's bodies or not.
So there's no way we're going to beat this part of the interview where you talk about how Trump is borrowing other men's bodies. But we're going to try anyway. At least one more thing. The question is, do they mean it, right? Because we were just talking about how they chant, lock her up, lock her up. And And I'm super worried about him winning a second term, as a lot of us are, but more specifically, and I think it's more dire than people realize. I think that after surviving impeachment, as we talked about earlier in the interview, he feels empowered, that the law, he's above the law. And then secondly, I think he does mean it. I think that he would lock up his political opponents if he got a second term. So given what you've studied, what do authoritarian folks who have very similar dispositions to Trump normally do? Do they mean it? Or is it all for show and theatrics, as we were talking about earlier?
No, they mean it. And one of the mistakes everyone makes, and it's really sad to see, Italy 1922, Germany 1933, one of the common things is that people think he's either a madman, or they think that he doesn't mean it, or that he'll get into office and then he'll calm down. And in the Trump case, it was called pivot. I call it the pivot delusion, that everybody thought that he would become normal as soon as he got power. And instead, every time somebody submits to him, he and other people like him, they feel more empowered. So he means everything he says. And in fact, there's remarkable continuity with his racism and his corruption. And he kind of tells you what he's going to do. It's just that we don't want to believe it. Either we're in denial, because it's also scary. Every time I give an interview, people write me saying, if it's when I go on Don Lemon, it's late at night. People write me saying, I couldn't sleep all night because of what you said. But I think it's important to have a realistic view of what can happen, because then we'll be better prepared if it does.
Yeah. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor at NYU, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, among her books is Italians, Fascism's Empire Cinema, as we talked about, not just about Mussolini, but about propaganda that helped him. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.